Good morning. My name is Meg Detloff, and I work for USGS PNAMP, supporting great collaborative projects like this. Thanks for joining us for the PNAMP Fish Monitoring Work Group Fish Population Names and GIS Boundaries Task Meeting. A couple of housekeeping tips before we get started. Please mute yourself by clicking the little microphone on your Teams platform. Also, please turn your camera off if you're not speaking. It helps everyone to stay focused. If you don't see the toolbar, try moving your mouse a little and it should pop up on the top or the bottom of your screen. You should see a bar that looks like something similar to what's on the screen right now. If you're just on the phone, use *6. If you have questions or feedback, please use the chat function or raise your hand and unmute yourself. And you'll need to manually unmute yourself. We can't unmute you. Let's see. We are recording the meeting today, and it will be available on our YouTube channel pretty soon, probably within the next 2 days. Now, I would like our task leads to turn their cameras on and introduce themselves.
Good morning, everyone. I think Evan needs to unmute. I'm Van. Nice to have you here.
And I'm Evan. I'm IDFG StreamNet Data Coordinator.
Yeah, and I should say I'm with PSMFC GIS Manager and supporting StreamNet for many years in GIS.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Now it's the participants' turn. Don't worry about turning your cameras on or turning your mics on. Just simply open up the chat and introduce yourself with name and organization. This just helps us keep track of participation. And while you guys are doing that, I'll just kind of briefly go over the agenda. On the agenda, I will introduce the Fish Monitoring Workgroup Charter and proposed engagement process, and then Evan will cover task description and lessons learned from experience with species range-wide assessments and coordinated assessments project before handing it off to Van, who will describe the proposed GIS workflow and products. Then we'll open it up for discussion and wrap with next steps. And with that, let me give you guys a nickel tour of the charter and the engagement process. So in the meeting email you received a link to the Fish Monitoring Workgroup Charter. This document gives an overview of the roles and responsibilities of this project. Your responsibilities as a general member and task team member are pretty simple. Aid in identifying topics of interest, serve as a subject matter expert for the task, provide input on products. We typically hold 3 full fish monitoring workgroup meetings per year, trying to kind of structure it around summer field seasons. The meetings feature a tech talk that we feel is of interest to our partners in the region and some current task updates. We also send out periodic emails with announcements or other information. You are more than welcome to send us papers or let us know if there's anything like an event or, something that might be of interest to the group. And you guys can kind of see a little snip of the charter right here. And then Becca will drop some links to the charter in the Fish Monitoring Workgroup page. And this also leads me in. Oh, thanks, Becca. This leads me into the engagement process. Originally, we were using Microsoft Teams, but due to issues with some organizations' firewalls, we're now using it as more of a temporary working space. Information about the project can be found on pnamp.org, and each task now has its own page with purpose statements, links to documents, and finalized products and events. Accessing the pnamp.org site is easy, open to everyone, and doesn't require jumping through hoops to get information. We, of course, still welcome folks to join the Teams platform. If you're interested in working directly in the shared documents, just let me know. Just shoot me an email and I can help you navigate that. Or you can visit the project homepage and it'll look something like this on the screen. Depending on if you're Department of Interior or outside, your process to get in is going to be different. All right. And with that warm up, I'm going to hand this over to Evan to talk about the task.
Morning, everybody. Thanks for taking the time to chat with us about this today. And it is, it's not just a presentation. Hopefully, it's a discussion. Van and I, we have a long history in doing fisheries tasks like this, but we're certainly not the only ones, and we're certainly not, the only experts in the room in this case. With that said, we've built upon what we've learned in order to, define population names and boundaries, and use those tools to help both manage and analyze data, specifically in the past, the anadromous species, using the NOAA fisheries and cub populations, for an example, and also during range-wide assessments for resident fishes like bull trout. So with that said, what we are trying to do here is come up with a way of defining fish population names and boundaries in a standardized, replicable, complete and correct way. And so Van is, he's going to be handling the actual methodology and the pilot project, and I'll just be giving you sort of a background. So you can see our purpose there, and we've already addressed that. And hopefully after this meeting and maybe a couple follow-up meetings, we will come up with both a GIS product and a tabular product based upon the attributes associated with those polygons representing both populations and ranges. And what we've done is we've chosen to start off using the USGS hydrologic unit code or watershed boundary data set, which is, if folks are used to the terminology, it's like a HUC6 or a HUC12. They're actually 12 digits, but some folks call them HUC6s. And then also grabbing the StreamNet generalized fish distributions and leveraging those to say which of those HUC6s actually fall within a fish's range, and then afterwards, which of those HUC6s actually constitute a population. So our next steps would be a finalized agenda with any additional materials that we would carry forward to the next meeting, where the experts, like biologists and other folks, can actually go over our pilot data set, and hopefully we'll come up with an acceptable, updated, if necessary, bull trout populations and ranges data set. Next slide, please. Oh, and also, if folks do have a question, feel free to raise your hand, or what I like to do is just type it into the chat. That way I don't forget the question that I had, and folks will see it there. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into the task description, an overview, and then the background. The overview, the population boundaries and attributes from the standardized replicable descriptive method, it's really important. It's how we go through and both analyze the data and summarize the data, both online and in reports. For instance, as I've said before, we started off with NOAA fisheries populations, and then we added in cub populations for the non-listed Chinook populations, or steelhead, or sockeye, or coho. Most folks are pretty familiar with that concept and using those data sets, whether in a tabular format or a GIS. So what Van and I are doing here is we're trying to expand it to other fishes, specifically many of the resident life histories, fishes like bull trout, and like most folks are familiar with, the cutthroats. If you've ever done a range-wide assessment for the cutthroats, or for bull trout, or for red band trout, you're familiar with the concept of taking the points of presence absence and extrapolating those to lines of distribution. And then we've taken it a step further, and we said this chunk of lines, or this selection of lines, is equivalent to a population. And then we assign a population ID to it, or we assign a key watershed or a core population ID to that group of polygons that encompasses the lines that was built upon the points of presence and absence. And so that's sort of a key concept here that I'd like to sort of throw out there for everybody to consider. Most folks are already familiar with it from status assessments and range-wide assessments and working with the fisheries data, but I just sort of wanted to get that out there so that we're all talking about the same thing, hopefully. Points of presence, absence, lines of distribution, polygons of ranges. And then within those ranges, we can select parts of those ranges and designate them as populations. And it looks like, Russell, you have a question about.
Just a quick question, just a clarification on the first bullet, the population boundaries and attributes from the standardized replicable descriptive methods. I just wanted to make sure, that includes the various codes that were applied, the run, if there is an applicable run, the status, all these different weird TRT NOAA codes that were created for like shorthand codes that people used. And that, as you said, it's replicable, and we're using a standard approach to come up with those names. That's what you meant by that standard approach, right?
Correct. And
okay.
And also using building blocks that everybody has access to, and they're all the same. In other words, this apple is equal to this apple, and so on. And by the way, then we'll be getting into more detail in the methodology and the technical GIS part of it. But and that's under one of the lessons learned, specifically what you're talking about, is how to cross-reference these data using hydrologic unit codes. Okay, so and next up would be the complete and correct layers in tables of fish taxa, analysis units, and management units. And so what we mean by analysis units and management units is sort of what Russell was just hitting upon. Is sometimes folks use the terminology population, sometimes it's MPG, sometimes it's ESU, sometimes it's core area, sometimes it's key watershed. If we use this USGS HUC6s as our base layer, then we can take other folks' data and assign HUC6s to it, and therefore join between the two data sets. And you can do it spatially or tabularly, and you can look at them on top of each other, different layers, if that makes sense. And in effect, cross-reference them. So that's what we're talking about there. So we're trying to come up with something that's flexible enough to accommodate everybody's analysis units, everybody's management units. And I already talked about populations are a subset of a taxon's native range. And that's something that Russell and some of the rest of us have been talking about for a while. If you think about spring, summer, Chinook distribution in the Pacific Northwest, and you look at the populations, you readily see that all of the populations do not encompass all of the distribution. For example, you wouldn't see the migratory corridors and so on heading down the Columbia and the Lower Snake or something like that. And so what we were talking about doing is also incorporating those areas into the range, and then within the range, selecting the areas that actually have spawning and rearing and are considered a population or something like that. So we wanted something that was also flexible enough to meet everybody's needs. And these are lessons that we've learned from range-wide assessments, status assessments, helping produce of Idaho, native fishes of Idaho. And it's even a concept that, Binky used way back in Western native trout of Western North America, I think it was, if that makes sense. Next slide, please.
Hey, Evan, Dan Rotting punched a question in. What is the geographic scope of the project, and Columbia Basin or something larger?
The scope of the project is based upon the fish's range. We like to have complete ranges per taxa. And so if that is encompassed within the Columbia River Basin, then so be it. But with that said, if we are directed to do this exercise for fishes outside of the Columbia River Basin, say coastal cutthroat or was it Dolly Varden would be, we're already going to do the bull trout. If we also want to do the Dolly Varden, then this methodology would still be flexible enough to accommodate that. Is that good, Dan?
Yeah,
Okay.
I would say generally the Northwest, right, where the Pacific Northwest, we're going beyond the Columbia Basin, including the Puget Sound, and the Oregon and Washington coast.
okay, so generally you're going to start with Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. Is that fair?
That's fair because we have generalized fish distribution to overlay with the Huck 6s, correct?
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, and Russell had just commented, suggested larger to match the PSMFC fish distribution layers. So Montana too.
Yeah. And what this conversation shows is that a lot of us have been thinking about this for quite some time. And so Van and I, like I said, we're just leading it initially, and hopefully it'll blossom and become, a very useful way of producing very useful tools. Next slide, please.
Just a quick note, Van and I had a conversation that, that's the primary focus is, matching the PFMSC fish distribution layers, as we said, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, but there's opportunities to engage California. If they get their data into coordinated assessments and other tools like this, coordinating with NOAA, is an opportunity. So,
you bet. So fish unit boundaries and names. Some of our, I've already thrown a couple of terms out there. Regulations is what we're dealing with here, and ranges. And generally speaking, these are the analysis units and the management units, the polygons that we use in order to group and summarize data and analyze it. Additionally, data geeks like me, we also use it to QA/QC data. It's, for instance, when taxa change, it's useful to grab a selection of, using a polygon rather than each little line or whatever, and update them all, say from shorthead sculpin to cedar sculpin or something like that, some other taxonomic change. So it's a useful tool. Also, we wanted to have, like I said before, a workflow that will accommodate all fish taxa for which we have generalized fish distribution. And that's one of the reasons why the range-wide assessments and status assessments come into play, because we do have generalized fish distributions for the species or subspecies of which we've done range-wide assessments or status assessments. It's critical that we have that one complete correct distribution from which to extrapolate the ranges and then the populations. And then also being times what they are, we're going to have a web service that will help support both StreamNet, Northwest Power Planning, or Northwest Power and Conservation Council, BPA, and other state, federal, and tribal organizations. In other words, one complete correct source that is maintainable in an efficient way so that everybody can use it and everybody's using the same analysis and management units. Next slide, please. And here's an example of, over here, we've recently been struggling to complete our statewide action plan for all fish and wildlife and some plants in Idaho. And what you're seeing here is an example of where new genetic analyses from stream surveys indicated that in this area of the red band trout range, in southern Idaho here, these red band trout have been isolated enough up above a historic geological barrier to where they are now genetically distinct from all their other red band trout brethren. And so during the statewide plan, they asked us to say, hey, Idaho needs to select all the fishes within, all the red band trout within these Huck 6s and designate this a red band trout Wood River population. So we assigned it a population ID. And so all of these data, like Russell was saying earlier, you can see that they're built upon Huck 6s, but then we assign all these to this population, and we say this population ID of 1 or whatever is equal to the Wood River population of red band trout. And so in this way, we can both create populations and we can also update taxonomy, both equally important in data managers' cases. Next slide, please. How am I doing on time? Good?
Yep,
Right.
just fine.
Alrighty, and then, so it's not just a GIS exercise. Van and I will be talking about the attributes associated with the geometry. The geometry, you know, of course, being the polygons representing the Huck 6s, representing the ranges, representing the populations, representing the key watersheds or the core pops, whatever you want to call them. And associated with those, we are also going to have the attributes go into SQL Server so that we can use them with NOSA, so that we can use them, you know, with our StreamNet deliverables, et cetera. And also so that we can describe them appropriately. This is a snapshot of the populations table from coordinated assessments, which, you know, a lot of people put a lot of time into coming up with this structure and the definitions. And one key thing to look at here is you see the unique ID first and foremost, and then you see all the attributes associated with it. And you can see that there are multiple analysis and recovery units that are cross-referenced within this table so that as things change, as other groups' needs change, we can come together and add a Cubfwa pop name in addition to the original pop name. And so it's very flexible, and yet it's black and white. You know, it's something that you can go to and something where you can see exactly what this field means. So again, everybody's talking about the same. We're sort of controlling the vocabulary so that we're all talking about apples to apples, oranges to oranges. Next slide, please. Yes, and good point, Judy. It's sort of addressing what Dan was saying. It's like, yeah, we really, you know, national boundaries, state boundaries, it's really not our priority. What we're talking about here are the fish ranges, irregardless of what lines humans put on the map. Yeah, so that's really not important. So with that said, that's it for my overview. We've gone over the concepts, we've gone over the background, and next up would be Van talking about the actual GIS or technical part of it. So if there aren't any further questions, Van, take it away, please.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, this is Dan.
Go ahead.
Yeah, this is Dan Rotting. I have a quick, hopefully it's a quick question. So I'm trying to understand what's actually being proposed. So I understand the concept of identifying Huck 6s for species presence. I'm not understanding what's going on after that, because to get to populations, then you need to understand something about genetics, demography, and those types of things. So can you clarify and you talked about a little bit about in your red band example, can you clarify after you do Huck 6s, are you proposing a next step?
Yes. What we're doing here, Dan, is coming up with a workflow or a model that will let us set the table for the biologists and the other experts on the taxa to designate which HUC6s belong to a population. For instance, during the range-wide assessments and the status assessments, we would all come together for those. And yes, absolutely, we would use so many variables, so many criteria to designate a population. The populations, you know, it always came last after the designation of the historic distribution, the current distribution, and then all of the attributes, the densities, the genetics, et cetera, associated with the current distribution. And then we would look at the current distribution and the barriers and connectivity, et cetera, and the experts designate what is or isn't a population. So that comes after Ann and I set the table, and we all come up with a structure that will accommodate those experts coming together and designating populations or not populations. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much.
Excellent.
I got a little confused when you went off on the red band example, but that sets it straight. And I think
yeah, and again, that wasn't me that
process
designated that population. I was just guided by the biologists and the other managers.
Yeah, and then sort of one last question. So are you, so we have extirpations that have occurred within the range. If you're going to talk about that later, that's great. But if you're not, I'd like to have some thoughts at some point in time about sort of how the current, how what you're doing would help inform whether we have current populations or whether we had historic populations. We had a bunch of challenges as we were doing things for salmon recovery planning. So
understood.
Thanks.
And Van will get into that. That's it. That's part of the juicy details that come next. I have to admit that is a rather intriguing part of this.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. Those are good questions, and it would help to kind of put some boundaries on what we're trying to achieve here with our effort up front, which I think it's worth stating. You know, this task and this working group came out of a stated need at some point for units to be able to start the process of making a display corollary for areas where we had data for fish for which populations or aerial units were not defined, and that we wanted to be able to track things like data availability. And so those are more data display and access drivers than, you know, population dynamics and genetics and those sorts of things. But they do feed together, and I think this workflow of first creating probable native ranges is a good one for lending an incremental, you know, step towards increase more explicit defined populations. So I think everyone here is probably familiar with both of these main primary inputs to the process that we're proposing. StreamNet's generalized fish distribution is available for many species. I think, you know, we've all come comfortable with the ones that we would consider to be, I'll use the term core, you know, in terms of like being somewhat comprehensive in the coverage across the Pacific Northwest, so that they're made available on StreamNet as separate data downloads for use in GIS, primarily the anadromous fish, and bull trout is one as well that's been fairly well comprehensively compiled by the partnership. Most are familiar with the fact that StreamNet's distribution layer is current distribution. So I didn't want to highlight that. To Dan's point, it does not include historic at this point, historical distribution at this point. So that'll be something that we need to keep in mind as we go through this process. And it does also track habitat use types, which may be useful for getting into the next, phase where we want to highlight those 6-level hucks where spawning is occurring. So the beauty from Evan and I, in talking about the approach here, the thing we like about using the watershed boundary data set is just the fact that it's this neat hierarchy that's standardized nationally and people are familiar with it. We can always roll up from the 6th level to larger, aggregated areas. But since it's, you can't break it up once you start, we're inclined to start with the 6th level as our minimum mapping unit building block to assemble other fish management analysis units from. So next slide, please. And please do, if you have questions, feel free to interrupt me, throw up your hand.
And Russ had just added a comment to add an element about population naming. We should use existing defined population names from existing name lists like that in CritFIC population names crosswalk tool, and also elements to support HCAC's process.
Yes, good point, Russ. And we will talk about the integration step in a minute here, because I do definitely want to make clear that we're not trying to redo what's already been done, especially by the official, authoritative sources, like in this case, Fish and Wildlife Service, which is managing the recovery plan and has already published data and plan. So we actually refer to that next, and that's a big part of the process. Russ, did you want to add something? No, okay. So just to, fortunately, from the GIS standpoint, those two inputs described lend themselves to a fairly formulaic process in the GIS. So this is just sort of to give folks, and sorry to get into the weeds a little bit here, but just the process that we'd be going through and have started going through for bull trout is one of preparing the fish distribution. One of the things we'll learn as we go through this for other species, this being mainly an effort to document a workflow, is that there'll be a need to prepare the data set to be aware of any limitations, whether it's about this issue of known historical areas of distribution that are not captured in the current layer, and just basically also an awareness of where there might be some gaps in coverage. So we've always make an attempt for to be comprehensive for those core species, but going through this does highlight opportunities to make improvements to the core fish distribution layer. It'll be an iterative process in that sense. So it's an opportunity for us to engage with the experts as we go through each species, including bull trout. So yeah, simply overlaying the two, identifying all of the distribution line work within each HUC6 and adding that code to the table that allows us to then summarize and break out, even summarizing like the different use types within a HUC, a 6-level HUC at the same time, so that can help guide the next stages. And then once that table is created, by then joining it back to a watershed boundary data set, you can actually, I'm imagining a maintenance workflow for multiple species at a time with, as fish distribution updates, you could rerun this and have updated ranges. So the example graphics on the right here are just giving you, the full extent of fish distribution from StreamNet, along with all the sub-watersheds in the region. And then below that is just this process playing out for bull trout. So in this case, those are all the 6-level HUCs. So the idea would be that, we would have ideally a fish management unit, analysis unit, potentially building blocks to name those things for all the areas for which we have a distribution record, and any other, hopefully monitoring records that might come in. So we have a place to cubbyhole of that data. Next slide, please. So this is where, getting to the next step of integrating what we're proposing with existing official data sets that are available from, in this case, for Bull Trout Fish and Wildlife Service. So on the screen here, we have the polygons defining the core areas as Fish and Wildlife defined them last in 2017. And 2018, the local populations were identified, and there's some categories within that, potential populations and areas where there are research needs, is my understanding. And this is a good point where I want to respect the Fish and Wildlife Service folks who were on the call. And if there's anybody who was a part of this process that has a desire to chime in and maybe provide some background, I would welcome it. But I just wanted to make clear that just as we did with in the coordinated assessments, we started off with NOAA's population boundary layer, and as we, as you saw in that table, for populations table in the CAX, the effort consciously did not change any of the official language codes that were used by NOAA. In fact, there are many fields in that table that are not displayed as part of the DES, the data exchange standard, because they're more like internal housekeeping for StreamNet. But we definitely respect the authoritative source in bringing that in. But there is an interest in a real utility in being able to standardize across different species for these things. So here's a case where we would consider the beginning of the process. In other words, we're not going to redo any of this, but we would start with the core areas, populations defined by Fish and Wildlife Service. Any questions about that, or anybody from Fish and Wildlife Service on the line want to chime in? Yeah, hi, Judy.
Let's see. Hi, this is Judy Neubauer. I was around to help develop some of our bull trout maps. So one of the other things I see, so thanks for sharing this and starting this up to try to merge our data sets with your data sets at some point here. But one of the things I see on your list here is historic core areas, and that might be something that you haven't done before. But that would be, we would have several of those types of polygons where we had historical habitat that we may or may not be working within to try to bring bull trout back. So I just thought I'd share that piece. But yeah, I've kind of helped work on some of these maps. I think Dan Nofi is on the call too, who's more recently been involved and is working on some of the range and status data that might help to update maps in the future too. So thanks.
Well, thank you, Judy. I'm really glad that you and was it Dan?
Dan Nofi.
Hi, Dan. I'm really glad you both showed up today. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And
hey, Judy, just to follow up, did you say that you do have polygons representing historic distribution or range?
Yeah, we have some pretty good maps. So we're actually currently working on updating our range of the species maps and species distribution layers. And Dan knows the data well. He's been collecting new data that may help to update that at some point in the future. But David Hines is our person that's really stores our data sets and has the most recent layers and GIS names and terminology and all of that. So he couldn't be here today, but he wanted to make sure he was linked into the process, and sounds like he'd been talking to some of you in the past.
Yes, he has.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And I don't have a whole lot to add. I think Judy pretty well covered it. As far as my role in bull trout currently, I wasn't around during a lot of the, well, it goes all the way back to the late 90s, but core areas and local populations. And we've held on to a lot of that just in the sense of recovery. As you probably know, the bureaucracy around changing policy documents is somewhat challenging, but we're in the process of going through a species status assessment and a 5-year status review. So we do have some information where we have been able to look beyond some of these polygons and say, oh yeah, we do know that this was historically, when I say historically, relatively recent times populated with bull trout, or that it might be a potential reintroduction area as well. So that does exist. It's, the way the multiple states, and one thing you don't show on here are the recovery units. Those kind of things, we do have people that are more experts for those areas, and we can certainly bring them into the fold if you find the need. But yeah, generally speaking, I mean, we have to respect kind of the core areas and local populations, but we know they're not perfect. And so they're a management polygon for us. They're a way for us to roll up. The core area represents a metapopulation that generally holds pretty true. We biologically can support that, except for what we call simple core areas. And those Montana has a ton of those, which are, a small alpine lake with one tributary stream. It's an isolated population. It really operates like a local population, but it's its own core area because it's naturally detached from anywhere else. But yeah, so thanks for the invite, and I'll be on for the entire call, and certainly keep me folded in. And if you have any specific questions, don't hesitate to reach out.
Excellent. Thank you, Dan and Judy. And I definitely will circle back with David Hines when he gets back. Yeah. And yeah, he'll stay a part of this process for sure.
Yeah, I was just going to add on, I thought of one other thing. I believe that our original maps were built off of HUC units to begin with. So they should overlap pretty well. The critical habitat layers definitely were built on HUC units. And I believe in our mapping effort, we're trying to update to the newest national data set. I think it's the USGS data set that you might be talking about, but David would know that.
Yes. Yes, and I can confirm that the ridge lines all line up nice and neatly. So it's a pretty straightforward process to try to integrate these, which is good news as part of the benefit of taking that approach. So thank you. One of the things I wanted to then talk about is, like, as we outlined in the process of going from respecting the original boundaries that have been defined by the agency that's in charge here, and then looking at actually, Megan, could you change the slide, please? So here we have the next level of throwing on top of the Fish and Wildlife Service defined management units, the current fish distribution for bull trout from StreamNet, along with then in the brighter orange is a selection of all of the 6-level HUCs that distribution enters into. So you can see there are areas where both migratory, areas between these core areas, and also some that for whatever reason in the initial pass that Fish and Wildlife Service did, they were not given a name or included in one of these other areas. So that those are the areas where potentially, just from a standpoint of trying to create a unit to put data into on the species and StreamNet and other data systems, there are use cases where folks would like to have a unit with a name they could reference for those areas, and that may well then, as Evan described, with a more thorough process, taking that as building blocks, could serve as an opportunity for biologists to actually get together for areas where they're familiar with the species dynamics there and assemble building blocks to create units that have a distinct purpose and name. Next slide, please. So here's a close-up example of an area in Oregon where we have the bright orange again being areas of distribution with potentially other data as well on bull trout, for which there's not a defined fish unit currently. And I think just to think through in the abstract sense, I didn't have plans to bring up a demo or look at database tables at this call, but there will be opportunities for that in the future, I believe. But I just wanted to illustrate this as an example of a point where all of these units in that table of the population table would have a reference, an ID, a name that's following a standard, including carrying the official name defined by the agency in those cases, you know, for the fish and wildlife core areas and populations, we would verbatim bring across what they're using. But these bright orange areas are where we'd want to be able to walk around with you guys as or other, you know, bull trout focused experts to be able to say, hey, how should we handle these areas? Should we lump here, or, you know, just consider them part of the range? And that's an opportunity to create some identifiers in the structure that would serve the regional, you know, data analysis needs. So we're going kind of fast through this. I'm totally open to questions if anybody at this point wants to jump in. I will say, you know, I know there's a lot, looking at the list of folks on the call, a lot of you have personal experience and maybe angst from going through these types of processes. And I see Denise on the line. Denise, you probably are having flashbacks of the days of trying to do that crosswalk exercise, and just understanding that, you know, the importance of being able to track the lineage of these things. It's definitely always been a need, because in various reports and data sets, reference will be made to a population or a unit, and sometimes it's really hard to be able to provide a visual correlate to what exactly that's referring to. So this is one of those opportunities to help kind of create some boundaries, literally. So next slide, please. All right, we're moving along quickly on the agenda. So I mean, I definitely looking forward to discussion on this, but I just wanted to outline the process and timeline for this work group and what we're thinking in terms of engagement and review on draft products. So that first step, as you can see, creating the probable native range based on fish distribution and HUCs is a straightforward GIS process, and I've already actually done that, but I haven't done the table integration at this point across the Fish and Wildlife Service areas, and that will be my next you know, priority. And I will just, you know, make note that in discussions with Russell, you know, Russ, we can talk about this so we have time. I have gone through and done this for the other species as well, the probable native range piece, and so we can talk about, you know, in the shorter term, creating products that will meet the needs of other efforts that are parallel to this. But for this particular work group, we want to really kind of maintain a focus on the bull trout example and use case. We can get it all the way through to completion by a reasonably short, you know, timeline. In this case, we're looking for the fall of this year. So with that, our envisioned plan would be to put out a draft product through web mapping application and send out a link and some instructions to this group to give us some feedback on what we you know, how we've tackled it in terms of assembling the probable native range with these core areas and populations defined by Fish and Wildlife Service, and then have an iterative process, some back and forth. Probably we would schedule through, with Megan's help, through a doodle poll, a couple of other meetings to engage with the group and get feedback. And if we learn that we clearly need to draw in other bull trout biologists to give us guidance on this, that would be an opportunity for that as well. But the initial timeline here and in some target dates of, like, you know, just to give you a sense of how much engagement we're hoping to receive from you all. We would be targeting getting out by May 12th, link to an application with instructions, and give folks, you know, 3 weeks to a month to explore the data and provide feedback. I might be providing an opportunity through the app to provide feedback, looking into that. And then based on that feedback, we would plan to pick out a revised version of the data set. And that's the point where we might also want to get together and discuss again the opportunities for further, you know, lumping those units within the native range into useful and meaningful units. And then ultimately, you know, as Evan highlighted, I think our real primary product that we see coming out of this is the workflow and the methods document that documents the workflow and provides guidance for how others can, ourselves most likely, but can take on this process for other species in the future. And then with the idea that in StreamNet's case, we would be tackling it following the priorities that StreamNet's leadership would help determine. But I know there's been mention, I know of white sturgeon and other species that are high on the list for sure, of importance for one level and others. So that'll be future conversations. I think we're at this point. I'm really interested in hearing some feedback and getting some open discussion going. I think the next slide is queuing that up. So yeah, I welcome you guys to turn on your videos if we can handle the bandwidth and just all have a discussion.
Yeah, Russ, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Van and Evan, for kicking this off. I really appreciate the effort. I've been a long time supporter of trying to help define the population boundaries and what we're doing. We've funded, as you know, the CritFIC population naming exercise, which showed the differences in variability of species populations with the same, how those layers are produced, the different names within the same area, and different watershed GIS layers used, or different processes to create boundaries. I think two things I would say is just at a high level. I think when I was talking with some people, defining a population and species range, people do get confused. And I look at one of NOAA's layers just as an example. Some ways to look at it is just the water bodies. So I think Sockeye, is a GIS layer that just has the water bodies and lakes that have population boundaries, and they haven't expanded it to the HUCs. I could be wrong. But I was just wondering, again, the definition for the populations in these ranges, of course, people look at it and say the fish don't go onto land, but we've been using those watersheds and the boundaries as areas that influence and impact those species. I think that's just something that may help us as, defining what we mean by these areas and why we're using those watersheds. The other component is when it comes to species range, I had a question, and some early products showed using HUCs in the watersheds down lower, and like migration corridors are the biggest thing that I have questions and opportunities for us to look at. And you and I had talked about this before. So we have the migration corridors in the main stem Columbia. Is it really appropriate, or can we do something a little bit different for some of the migration areas to maybe narrow that not to the watersheds, but to using rivers and lakes areas or other GIS layers that are polygons from the rivers to kind of constrict that so it's not showing all the watersheds. It may help, may not. It's just one idea. The other component of the species range thing that will help, was we know that fish go into the ocean. How do we define that range? I think that's another dilemma that hasn't necessarily been discussed. I think just for people's awareness, the applications of where I'm coming from in our use and why I've been trying to get these things help sort it out is Van, and I've shared this before. Just thought I'd share this with the group. Two things that we use is we're trying to use these GIS layers to help people identify attribution, needs for permits or other things. So focal species that restoration work that we fund benefits. And there's things that QA/QC and check and provide things for our contracts for our environmental compliance office or for others. That when somebody says that they're doing work that applies to this primary focal species, we're trying to use GIS layers that will say, hey, this is outside the range of that species. Are you sure? And so we're getting huge problems with main stem areas, estuary, or areas that multiple species just travel as something that's linked. The other side of things are that we do have people trying to produce some products that look at carrying capacity products and watersheds, and I've talked, how do we produce those species range and those population layers, and how do we produce those, ensure that those population names and that information is shared. And I think when I look at making sure that information gets to the coordinated assessments, that we have a good way to share and locate that information, because BPA funds a lot of work for non-listed species in the Columbia, and in, for resident and anadromous species that haven't been using these NOAA layers, and being able to picture use something to show those layers and get recognition that we're benefiting those species is something that's helpful, I think. And having a go-to layer that we can point to helps us. I think when I mentioned the ocean side, the last piece is we fund NOAA's ocean research. And of course, they have a bunch of points in the ocean, but we don't, when a QA/QC check comes up and it says, well, what species, you're outside the species range and boundary, are you sure? And so we know that the fish are in the ocean, but I think it's helpful to potentially have those range maps in a GIS layer that shows those boundaries at some point. But that would be a later focus potentially of trying to add those in, because whenever we're trying to do infographics and share information about species range, it's sometimes hard to find. We always just have to go to some image somebody may have created a long time ago, rather than looking at something that may be produced and standardized for everybody to use here. So, thank you.
Thank you, Russ. Yeah, so just to comment on your suggestion about the main stem and how to handle that differently, perhaps with using a maybe buffered river section or something. My first inclination is to want to have a standardized map unit that we use to assemble these things. I get that there's a need to communicate clearly what it is we're saying when we do that, and I think Evan, when we discussed this, you said it clearly where it was like we're just saying that in the sense of using the term probable native range, that when you're in one of these polygons, there's a high probability that the species is in there somewhere. Right? I mean, it's not saying they're only within the main stem river, so maybe that's and maybe that's a step too far to say that in some cases where there are refugia along the way. But I'm open to hearing, as the GIS guy in the room, I'm definitely wanting to defer to the biologist on how to think about displaying this type of stuff. But my mind goes to maintaining standardized workflows and processes, and I kind of wonder what are you buying yourself, really? Because you can always, we're rolling up a level of abstraction that we already have the line work from distribution. So if we're wanting to be clear, we can put the line work of distribution on the map along with the polygons. But the polygons, I see them as cubby holes for compartmentalizing the data in some ways, right? Evan, I don't know if you have something to add to that.
I like the way that you just phrased it there. We have different levels of certainty associated with the points and the lines and the polygons. I understand what folks are saying about some of the polygons being too large. They'd like them to be smaller. We just went through that with our state wildlife action plan for white sturgeon. They didn't feel comfortable using the Huck 4s or Huck 5s, so we updated it to the Huck 6s. But we did stick with the Huck 6s that were intersected by the lines of distribution for the white sturgeon. And everybody agreed that that was a very good representation of the current presence for white sturgeon in the Snake River. The Snake River being very similar to the Columbia River, where we have, the primary use type of being, just a migratory corridor for many taxa. So that should address, using the Huck 6s, that should address folks' more narrow understanding of distribution and range. With that said, I think we all know that rivers have a tendency to go in and out of their existing channels. And so maybe, we've all seen old distributions based upon old line work representing streams, that if you overlay that on the most current aerial imagery, the river is clear the heck over on the other side of the floodplain. So they're all just estimates for where these fishes are given a certain place and time. And I think it's really important that nobody misunderstands and says that we're 100% certain that they're completely within all of the water within this polygon. That's not what we're saying here. We're just saying that we know, based upon the best data and the experts at the time, that yeah, they are present within some of the, at least some of the water bodies within this HUC 6, period. That's all. And that's been borne out by all the survey data during all the range-wide assessments. So I think everybody's cool with that. I think this will be an improvement using the HUC 6s. It'll help take away a lot of the heartburn associated with the HUC 4s. Cool.
Yeah, I think that that's a good statement and a good thing for everybody to understand. When I looked at the examples of something provided earlier, a long range of the cowlets was provided, and but pulling up the fish distribution layer and having that in concert with those disclaimers, I think, help make everybody understand. Again, we're trying to maintain it to these areas and in close proximity, and there's no guarantee. So I think that's a good statement and a good approach for consistency across the region. So.
Go ahead, Judy.
Yeah, hi. That was good discussion. We're in that same discussion, talking about actual distribution versus a range map or a map that we might use for ESA Section 7 consultation or permitting. So the team that we have developed right now that's working on this is working on updating our distribution to be as accurate as possible. But we are also working on a second map, I think. But we're in the mode of discussing how those two might take form right now, and what types of rule sets we'll use to have in either map. So just so you know, we're also in the middle of that same discussion. We've had complaints about, for example, Washington State, when they go onto our ESA website to look up areas to see if their projects line up with a bull trout area or habitat, they'll get the counties. So the counties is quite a large polygon, and so we're narrowing it down from counties at least into some kind of a HUC type distribution, it sounds like right now. And we may use some other kind of buffers within that to try to include potential areas where bull trout might be, where we don't have the access to survey data or whatnot. But let's just say a project is occurring in an area and it might be a 10-year project. At some point, bull trout could show up there. So we're not quite sure how we're defining that rule set yet, but I just wanted to let you guys know we are also in that same discussion. But we are relying heavily for the actual distribution on a pretty stringent data set to outline, what we already have done in the past, make sure that's still accurate. If any new data is available, does it meet certain standards? So at least you'll know that's kind of where we're going on our distribution. This other map is a little bit fuzzy right now.
Excellent. Can I ask Judy what the timeline is you guys are working on for that process? Is this
I think Dan Brown would know more about our timeline on that. We've been through a couple iterations and working with our partners and trying to get data and make sure our boundaries are just, but I'm not sure we have an actual deadline right now. It was actually a few months ago, and we've extended that a little bit to get better data. So okay. I'm hoping that it's this year that we get through that, but I'm not sure about the actual timeline deadline.
Okay. Well, I'm glad that we're having the discussion and that the processes that we're both, definitely want to be able to feed into that effort if possible, and vice versa, benefit from it if there's data that could help make what we're doing more complete and more useful to what you're doing, honestly.
Yeah, I think it'd be probably really helpful to get with David Hines.
Yeah.
And he's already got a pretty stringent database going with the attributes table and whatnot. given different years of work we've worked on this. So it has come from our original recovery plan back in 2004, our critical habitat layers that we developed all the way out until 2010, and then our recovery plan maps that were developed in 2015. So, and then now we're working on this kind of second iteration based on, I think it's 2017's layer and updating that.
Just one thing I want to add to what Judy said, and she's right on. David is kind of on top of that stuff, and that I feel like, Judy, that map is pretty close to being done. I want to throw Mark Nelson under the bus and say he was the one holding it up, and that was Idaho, and it actually had to do with this, with some of the data that you all have, and we could talk about that another time, but it's really, what is the question being asked, right? Is it, should it trigger consultation, or is it a maybe present map, or is it a, we have no reason to believe that they couldn't swim up that stream? One other thing I want to throw out, just for folks that may not be tied into bull trout stuff really well, is that one of the things that we've kind of embarked upon for the species status assessment and the 5-year status review was to basically put together working group teams for each core area. And what I'd like to see are those teams perpetuate into the future and to basically take on their own ability, that it's not the service. And in the case of Idaho, IDF&G, Brett Bowersox and myself to lead those, but for the team, each core area to continue to perpetuate the conversation. I think it could be a really powerful tool to get some really good feedback on distribution. A lot of those discussions, I envisioned kind of the old world that I lived in my first realm of the fisheries world back east, was you pull the topo maps out on the table and you get your colored Sharpies and you draw where the fish are at and where the, in the case of bull trout, where brook trout are at and where barriers are, that kind of thing, because it's amazing how much we know about a lot of these areas and how much we haven't documented it. And we're, some of our finest biologists, especially on forests and BLM in Idaho, are retiring, and with it is 30 years of really specific knowledge, not only about where the species has been during their career, but where we've lost them, where we've thought they never were and have found out they are. And so it's really a powerful tool that I think could really be squeezed to get a lot of juice out of in the future.
Good point.
I was going to mention too, I was looking at your layers that you were trying to design for other fish populations. And one of the hard areas for bull trout is splitting out spawning versus rearing. So typically we haven't drawn a hard fast line. We have critical habitat bull trout layers where we have spawning and rearing. And then we have foraging, migration, and overwintering. So we have maps with those types of lines on them. So if we're going to be splitting further than that, that might take you a lot longer than the end of the year. Just because a lot of people aren't willing to draw that line in the sand where actual reds end and what actually is juvenile rearing versus what is all other type of rearing, So when we developed critical habitat, we thought, okay, well, juvenile rearing, bull trout don't move around too much for the first few years. Although in some areas they do move down to a lake or a river to rear if it's fairly close. So we have combined those as spawning and rearing for juveniles under 150 millimeters per se. And then FMO is really designed for juveniles greater than 150 millimeters or so, generally speaking, because we know they migrate further. And so then that also includes adult migration or rearing. However, as folks know, bull trout can be anywhere in their whole range at any point in time during the year, and a lot of telemetry shows that. So it's a little harder with bull trout, especially if they're a migratory form.
Yeah.
Hey, Van, my comment on the side was, just for everybody's awareness, one of the pieces is that, PFMSC and StreamNet has been maintaining a fish distribution layer that has migration, spawning, rearing as a starting focal point that could help us do pieces. And again, I think that was one of the foundational layers that you would start with. And I think it's great to be able to, at the end of the day, whenever we get new information from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on the distribution and range, I think, like, for example, there's some new genetics data that showed Upper Yakima, the fish were not, the eDNA showed that they weren't there in certain reaches. So are they extirpated? How do we change the classifications? How do we update those? And we had an exercise recently with a modeling process with Dan Isaac that showed snorkel surveys with IDF&G, ODF&W in the Grand Ronde, and John Day provided proof that steelhead and Chinook were in at least 100 kilometers of stream that weren't classified as fish rearing and migration or rearing areas. So those are the things that how do we make sure that as we get new data, we can update the fish distribution layers and coordinate those. So if U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is updating their layer, hopefully that information could get synced with PFMSC's fish distribution layer. So we're all being provided the same information at the end of the day.
Yeah, thank you, Russell. And I'll just note, glad to see like Jake Chambers and Michelle Grossbeck on the line here as well. Ideally, will we maintain that process of having the StreamNet partner agencies first incorporate data into their systems and then submit it onto the region so that we're all on the same page. And that I look forward to the opportunity to improve bull trout specifically as part of the effort that you described, Judy. And I do recognize, maybe to go back to your point about splitting out spawning and rearing, in the use types and the generalized fish distribution for StreamNet, for the most part, most records are combined spawning and rearing as one use type. So I recognize if you're saying splitting those out separately, yet again, that's a deeper distinction that's hard to make, I imagine.
Yeah.
We have rearing only if we needed it.
Right.
Yeah.
There is some, but a lot of the records are kind of combine those. They're not
correct, as they should be.
Yeah.
This is Dan Rotting from Washington. I've got a couple of comments. So first, I think it would be very helpful to be very specific about the purpose of the exercise. And part of what's gone on in this discussion is we've talked about presence absence data, which is really point data. We've talked about distribution data, which is really line work. We haven't even touched whether the point data or the distribution data is how accurate that is. So in looking at what you're doing, I think going with polygons based on spawning and rearing should be a good first start, and sort of be clear that the polygons are likely areas, known or likely areas of spawning and rearing. I don't think you can have a single map that does all of the things we've just talked about in the discussion. So I recognize that there's a need for migration corridors. I recognize there's a need for ocean distribution, maps that are maybe more updated, but I don't know how we're going to have the data to actually update those maps. So, so I think those are a couple of comments that I had, and I think you guys are off doing a good start on this. And the other thing that is on your plate is sort of moving on to other species. And from Washington's perspective, I can tell you that as we move, we have less information as we move from anadromous fish to bull trout to resident salmonids and other fishes. And the ability to do point or line work for other fishes is going to be really problematic. So thinking about how your framework translates from bull trout to other species is important. I think you guys just had a discussion about some of the challenges you had in Idaho for that work. I think that's really good, but I think keeping an open mind into how the framework moves forward is important. And I think based on the polygons and what I've heard so far, I think it's a great start. So thank you for my comments.
Cool. Hey, Van. Yeah. And Dan, yeah, one of the things that most of us here have learned from coordinated assessments was on one of Van's slides, which lessons learned. And I believe it was keep it simple, keep it focused, at least initially, similar to what we did with coordinated assessments, where focus on one achievable goal. It was the lesson learned slide from prior experience, and that was to keep it simple, keep it focused. And both Van and Megan had to keep reminding me of that as all of these other tangential questions and needs came to mind. And so, yeah, your point's well taken. You know, we'll work out this first pilot project and then expand it where we can and where applicable to other fishes. Yeah, that's a really good point, and something, you know, to make sure that we stay focused on. Yeah, so that's all that I wanted. I just wanted to say that, yeah, we appreciate that very well.
Yeah, and I think a focus on bull trout is important and timely for the region and for and I think that's a really great start. So anyway, I appreciate all your work. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan. And if anybody else has any comments, feel free to unmute yourself, or if you're feeling shy today, just type it in the chat. I know Van had mentioned Denise has previously kind of been involved in some of this stuff. If anybody has any red flags, anything they struggled with in the past that maybe these guys could benefit from knowing, I think that would be helpful.
I think there's one quick thing. This is Russ. Go ahead with whoever else is speaking. I'll come back in a second. I'll let somebody else.
It's just me, Russ. It's Marika.
Okay.
Just to comment, I'm sorry I came into this a little late today and just now kind of coming into this task in general, but from the discussions I'm hearing, there's obviously a lot of dynamics that are happening with fish populations, you know, as you know, climate change and barriers and other factors are kind of affecting their distribution. How is, I guess, this the products going to deal with some of those dynamics? For example, you know, as you know, habitat are decreasing in certain areas due to, you know, degradation, dewatering, climate issues. You know, there are some restoration actions that's actually either reopening old distribution via, you know, culverts, changing culverts, or modifying barriers of some sort to open up potential habitat. How is this map going to deal with some of those dynamics where are you able to categorize some streams as, you know, there being historical distributions that maybe they're not there now, but it should still in some cases be priority, even though they're not there, there was potential for actions to open up those previously absent streams for fish, especially as, you know, climate might be forcing some of these sensitive species to higher elevation habitat that might be a reason for there to be, you know, a way to account for that in this product.
Howdy, Marika. Glad you could make it. Van and I, we talked about that two different ways. I did initially. I used the Wood River red band trout update due to new genetic information from samples taken during stream surveys as one example of how this workflow, it's not just a static map or a static layer, it's more of a workflow, a process to help us create, define, and also maintain these layers. And so my example would have been, the Wood River red band trout, how they went from just plain Jane red band trout to Wood River red band trout for our purposes based upon all of our latest survey data and the genetic analyses from samples therein. I also, would point to Bonneville cutthroat trout, the latest, greatest update there, and some of the changes that we, where we had to both expand distribution within the range and expand populations or decrease densities associated with the population. And I'm afraid to say in some cases, remove some streams, if not segments, from current distribution. And that's why it's sort of important to think about this more as a workflow, a process, a method with which we can create, define, and maintain these layers. Van, I think you went into it in a more technical way, but how would you answer her questions about how to maintain this and update it?
I think you described it well. I mean, I think we, just from a StreamNet standpoint, I recognize that we don't start from the basis of having historical distribution and all that upfront in the current generalized fish distribution layer. So that's a known limitation that we need to keep in mind, and that would be an extra step. I know, Evan, in your work with other range wide assessments, that's kind of the first thing you do as part of the process. Is you guys at the state level are assembling historical distribution as well. I do think I guess some of what you pointed out, Marika, thank you for that, I think is more, not so much how to maintain, how to leverage the units that get defined for helping to assess conditions in impacting those units. That's more a management consideration, but I would think that's one of the reasons why I personally like the idea of using the 6-level HUCs, because they're being used for tracking all kinds of other things on the landscape that have an impact that can be assessed and summarized by that unit that's relevant. One example is the National Fish Habitat Partnership has done a national level assessment based on that unit to create indicators for fish habitat degradation at that scale. So that's one of those things that ability to benefit from other assessments that occur using those units in a standardized way is a good thing to be able to plan for. Yeah, I think Evan kind of hit it with the idea that it's iterative. So if something comes up that points out the need to update, it's nice to have a workflow to pull off the shelf and follow. So.
Yeah, and it was mainly like, say you have a watershed that's not prioritized currently because there's no fish in that watershed, but there is potential for that to be, good habitat if, a barrier is removed or habitat work is being done. So being able to still kind of recognize some of these areas as priority, even though maybe the fish are still not utilizing it because of some X, Y, and Z reason.
So Van and Marika, I think this comes up to one of the comments I was making earlier about the NOAA's classification of the GIS layers that they used. Currently, the example I would go to is Snake River Spring Chinook. If I go to the Lemhi Basin or I go to the Antiat for spring summers, they will designate watersheds as outside the legal limit because there's a barrier, natural or anthropogenic, but it's still part of the overall population boundary, but as an area that's been identified that the fish range may not be going into at the moment. But we have seen through the restoration process, BPA has restored a lot of the Lemhi side channels. Fish are now using those streams, even though they are considered outside the legal limit of NOAA's population layers. Those probably should be updated because we've done the restoration to restore flow and maintain water in those streams today. And I think that was the question I was looking at and just a comment earlier is making sure that we have those things identified at the 6 field and the population. So hopefully those are things that in advance as it will evolve, and having a place that we know maps and paired with the fish distribution layers or other things that we can question and then go to and rerun or update these layers to show that this watershed now actually has species range. And how do we handle, I think this will come to some comments that we have before, so there's extirpated populations for Clearwater Chinook. Those populations are listed as extirpated under NOAA's GIS layers, but fish are currently there from the hatchery stocks. How do we manage those populations? Are they a different population name from a hatchery stock, or are those truly, the South Fork Clearwater, spring summer Chinook, but just with, or are they at the hatchery stock? How do we want to manage that population? Or how do we want to show that? Because today at BPA, we're not able to, show the GIS layers or have the GIS layers for non-listed species or non-listed areas. And how do we ensure that our information, I think for Dan and for everybody else, I think for this task is I think if we can help align it to some of the other objectives or outputs of how are we going to plan to use this, coordinate, show information, I think may help some of the, some of the background. What are the applications of this? These products will help. So, for BPA and council to get a consistent focal species list for us to use and fund and maintain the fish distribution layer that's currently part of the StreamNet scope of work. How do we do this? How do we maintain these? And I think it will help. And I think it'll help also close, and provide an avenue for different entities to provide data for populations that may have different names historically or among different organizations, but be provided to the same format and coordinated assessments. So I think that's something that we can work on. I can help with is, what are the applications for these and what are we trying to do? And I know, definitely going down the route of bull trout and doing this is one piece. I've been waiting many years since we funded the original population crosswalk exercise to get a population GIS layer so we could show it in CB Fish for, helping us QA/QC and help manage some of the information and report out the status of the species for all the data that we're collecting and funding. It's not our responsibility, but I think when it comes to the council's high-level indicators, goals, and objectives, they're trying to show and point to these non-listed species. What's their status? It used to be in the CUBFLOS state of the resource report. It's just how do we provide that information as some foundational GIS work to highlight those population areas and the data that we know is being collected or is not being collected. So thank you. I have to run to another meeting, but thank you very much for kicking this off. I'm sorry. I think it's a really good start. I'll follow up in a bit.
Thanks, Russ.
Thanks, Russell. Take care.
Appreciate that. Yeah, I think it's a very good point that one of the primary use cases is being able to show where we do and don't have data, try to get the data gaps.
Yeah, and if you guys aren't watching the chat, Judy had just commented, FYI, for bull trout, Fish and Wildlife Service has critical habitat defined in their maps along the coast of Washington and in the Puget Sound. It's part of their range currently. All right. Anyone else have any thoughts? Yeah, go ahead, Evan.
Yeah, that's sort of and I hesitate to even bring this up because taxonomy has been, and the changes in taxonomy has been problematic. Well, for me and for, I'm sure, a lot of other data managers, but yeah, and so how would we, that's a good point, Judy. How would we deal with what taxonomists have chosen to call Dolly Varden versus what taxonomists have chosen to call bull trout? My first instinct is to go back to what Megan and Van said and keep it simple, stay focused. And so I am totally unfamiliar with the state of the data for Dolly Varden. I do know that I'm vaguely familiar with the range extending all the way up through Canada and into Alaska, I believe. So alarms immediately start going off in my head about, in other words, if we can't get, like Dan said, if we can't get to the presence absence data and then the derived distribution data in order to update the generalized fish distribution and then to intersect it with the HUC6s in order to derive the ranges, do we even want to go there at this point? I mean, I understand you all probably have to legally, but for this group's purposes, maybe we need to deal with that on down the road, if I'm understanding what you say correctly.
Well, I think if you're just thinking about bull trout and you're not thinking about Dolly Varden, it's the bull trout. So maybe, years ago, people used to assume that the bull trout that are out in the saltwater are Dolly Varden. That's not the case. They are mixed, but it's more that they are more mixed up in the northwest corner of Washington. So like the Dungeness River, there's a lot of science out there that has done genetic analysis to describe those watersheds where Dolly Varden are. We don't know all of them, but that's something that you can tick off in the future. And then, if you're thinking about the range extending up into Canada or the bull trout as well, maybe you just want to draw the line off at the Canadian border for now.
Yeah.
Because, and then it kind of goes back to why are you building the maps? Is it for use in Washington, in the Pacific Northwest? Is it for use in Canadian waters also? So you might want to tackle some of those questions, but for the service, bull trout are only listed in the lower 48. So we are drawing our line at the Canadian border, but we have populations that are transboundary. So like the Salmo population in Northeast Washington, the populations up there by Bellingham, the Nooksack, we have some other Skagit. So those, and then on into Montana, we have a few populations that are transboundary. So where we have those transboundary populations on our maps, we're noting that and noting that, this population doesn't just end there. And drawing the lines up into Canada to show that for now. That's where we've landed on that, because it's the migratory corridor or it's the spawning and rearing in either country, depending on how the stream is situated. So like the Salmo up in Northeast Washington, a lot of the spawning is in Washington, but the connectivity to the Columbia River is in Canada. So you can kind of see the point. It might be some good discussions had there on how you want to draw those lines, and maybe we want to brain think on some of that.
Yeah, we'll run into the similar issues with the sturgeon, the white sturgeon in the Columbia and the Kootenai. So, yep.
But for sure in the Puget Sound, we can't say they're not there. They're in the Puget Sound. We have lines on our critical habitat map where we've used like 10 meters in depth, and we have some 10-meter lines out into the Puget Sound that we utilize for drawing some boundaries. Same with off the coast, and David has that information. So we don't put in the whole ocean. We put in these critical habitat boundaries for now. Not to say that they're in other areas, but that's kind of what we've been using as distribution.
Yeah, so again, that, it just speaks to the importance, of Van and I proposing a workflow, a process, a method that is maintainable. It can be updated, because, our understanding of the sockeye kokanee, it's also evolving like that. you know, where we're finding out that, yeah, there are still native kokanee persisting in outside of the Salmon River drainage. So that's good to know. And also the life histories aren't quite as clear cut as we thought they used to be, you know, between the resident and the anadromous. So yeah, that's cool. I like it when we learn more about the fishes and we can accommodate that with our workflows. It's good.
Agreed. I just, on the comment of transboundary units, I personally would love to be as inclusive as possible where we can. And you know, I know that we usually stop at the border, but especially when, you know, if Fish and Wildlife Service has transboundary, you know, polygons that you're using for those, that would be worth incorporating in my mind to be as accurate as possible in displaying things. I know that like the watershed boundary data has transboundary harmonization, I guess they called it, you know, trying to get in sync with the Canadians on watershed units. So there's some potential there. We just don't have right now fish distribution, you know, crossing over. So but I'm completely on the record open to doing, you know, a more comprehensive look, especially where there's those kinds of like sticklers where the fish can't get from A to B without going up and across. So it seems silly to cut it off. So definitely.
That's a weird thing for people to think about, having fish have to go north and then they got to go south, you know, go up north into Canada and then come south back into their spawning habitat. So it's a weird concept. People don't get to think about that too often, but just because of the glacial, you know, areas that we got up there in that northeast northern boundary area with Canada for bull trout, that's how they developed, you know.
Cool.
Awesome. Thanks, Judy. All right, guys. We got about a little more than 20 minutes left, but if you guys are kind of winding down, I know sometimes it's nice to go off and kind of process all this information. And I mean, you guys are all obviously welcome to contact Van and Evan, you know, if you come up with stuff later and, you know, have time to marinate some of this information. So if nobody else has any comments or thoughts for Van and Evan, I think we'll probably start to transition into the wrap up. Are you guys feeling good?
Sounds good.
All right, cool. Let me share my screen again. All right, and so we'll just ease into the wrap up. Here's up at the top, here is the task lead contact information again. The meeting summary, the recording will be available probably this week by Friday. Here's a link to the project page and last week's full group meeting. Yeah, I don't know if I stuck that in there. Becca will drop the link though. Oh, yep, there it is down there. Just so you guys know, last week's Tech Talk was from NOAA's Eli Holmes, who presented on common metric methods for ESU and DPS trends and status and other analysis involved in the writing of NOAA's 2022 biological viability assessment. So in case you guys were interested in, you know, how they process your data, how they analyze your data, it was a really good talk. And to close out today, I would like to give a big thank you to our fish monitoring work group task leads, Evan Brown and Van Hare. And thank you to you guys, to the task team, for joining us and participating. We really appreciate you guys taking time out of your busy schedules to help coordinate these activities and develop products to help the managers and biologists throughout the region. And with that, thanks again, and you guys have a great rest of your day.